Imagine a world where one man was solely in charge of a sport that generated hundreds of millions of pounds of revenue, and you are imagining Formula One in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Aside from Michael Schumacher, the name Bernie Ecclestone was the most recognizable in F1 at the start of the century. But who was he? And how did he come to own an entire sport? To start, let's discuss the man himself. Bernie Ecclestone was born in 1930 in the small English town of St Peter, South Elmham in Suffolk. Ecclestone grew up during World War II and was 15 years old at the time of the war's end. After the war, Ecclestone lived a fairly normal young life, but soon his interest in motorsports began to take over. Following the end of World War II, he began trading parts for motorcycles and even set up his own dealership for some of his beloved two-wheelers. In 1949, he got his first taste of racing when he entered the 500cc Formula 3 series. And although he only raced in a few events, he picked up the odd win and was generally well considered by those watching. But as many who hope to one day drive in Formula One soon find out, his talents left much to be desired. He suffered a series of accidents, most notably at his local circuit, Brands Hatch, where he collided with Bill Whitehouse and was thrown out of the cockpit and into the public car park next door. As a result, he decided to look into management as a safer way to be involved in the sport. He became the manager of the British driver Stuart Lewis Evans, and after purchasing 2 chassis from the now defunct Connaught team, he tried to qualify for the Monaco Grand Prix, but missed out on the final grid. Managing Lewis Evans was Ecclestone's life for the next 2 years, until 1958, when the young driver met a fate far too common in that era of motorsports. During the Moroccan Grand Prix, Lewis Evans' engine exploded, and he suffered burns so severe he died 6 days later. A shocked and devastated Ecclestone once again decided to retire from racing. It would be 12 years before Ecclestone would return to the sport that he loved, but one that had cost him dear. And he did so as a very wealthy man. For in the meantime, he had become an astute salesman of most notably Mercedes cars, with the likes of Shirley Bassey being amongst his clients. In his return to motor racing, he became manager of Jochen Rindt and was partial owner of his Formula 2 team. But tragedy struck once more when Rindt died at Monza. Ecclestone's whole life changed in 1971, when he had an offer of $120,000 accepted to buy the Brabham team, a figure that would likely buy you a single wheel nut nowadays. It was here that he began to solidify his place in Formula One. Some of the names that Ecclestone employed would go on to earn a place in F1's Hall of Fame, including Graham Hill, Niki Lauda, and Nelson Piquet. It was the latter who convinced Ecclestone not to hire a certain Brazilian driver called Ayrton Senna. Ecclestone would remain in charge until 1988, when he sold the team for $5 million to Swiss businessman Joachim Lüthi, netting him roughly 41 times what he originally paid. His time in F1 was not done though, for all the while he was working as a team owner, he began pulling the strings at the highest level of the sport. Ecclestone had begun a friendship with Max Mosley in 1971, and it would prove to be one of the most influential in F1's history. With Ecclestone's business acumen and Mosley's background in racing, they had the finger on the pulse when it came to what the drivers and teams wanted, as well as what would increase the size of their wallets. The next part of the story begins to sound like some episodes from Game of Thrones. On one side, you have the Garagistas, and on the other side, you have the FIA. The Garagistas was a term coined by Enzo Ferrari to describe the independent British teams, while the Grandees were the team's traditional outfits of Ferrari, Alfa Romeo, and Renault. The British teams would form the Formula One Constructors Associations, also known as FOCA, which had the likes of Frank Williams, Mosley, and Ecclestone amongst its members, with the goal of promoting their interests to the FIA. Round 1 of the battle went to FOCA, as they secured appearance money for all teams. But this was just the first blow in what would prove to be a decade-long war. We were not in the room at the time, but we can only imagine that Ecclestone's accession to the head of FOCA in 1978 was similar to Jon Snow's coronation as King of the North. Hashtag spoilers, you really should have watched it by now. Members stood on the table of some discreet back room at an unnamed circuit, helmets raised above their heads, shouting, "King of the Paddock!" With Mosley at his side as legal advisor, the newly elected chief waged war against the FIA. But the battle was not fought on some muddy field, but instead in the courtroom. FOCA set about attacking the FIA's subsidiary arm, who were known as FISA, and thus the FOCA-FISA War was born. In a battle of tug-of-war that saw one side winning, then quickly the other, Ecclestone and FOCA emerged victorious in 1987, with the landmark creation of a new company to manage Formula One commercial rights called the Formula One Promoters Association. Although there were attempts at a fightback, there was little Ecclestone's opponents could do, as the new association, which exists to this day as Formula One Management, secured 47% of the TV revenue to split amongst the teams, 30% to the FIA, and in a move that Succession's Logan Roy could only dream of, 23% went to the Promoters Association. Or, to be blunt, straight into Ecclestone's pocket. Ecclestone's master plan was complete. Because as teams pushed him as the leader of a group trying to get a bigger slice of the pie, he had outsmarted them and cut off the biggest slice for himself. In 1993, Mosley became president of the FIA and FISA was disbanded, and soon Ecclestone's close friends began taking up positions at the sport's governing body. Ecclestone had seized control, and Formula One was his. He was crowned the F1 Supremo by the media and would run the sport for a staggering 40 years. The 92-year-old may no longer be a part of Formula One, but the decisions made and the visions he created can still be seen today. He may have won the war for control, but he was not done yet. Under Ecclestone, Formula One went from a sport loved by the enthusiasts to a global business. He was not a man without controversy, though. In the wake of Senna's accident in San Marino, Ecclestone informed the Brazilian's family that he had died despite him still being alive at that point. This created a rift between Ecclestone and the family of the driver, who he came very close to signing for Brabham, so much so that the F1 chief was banned from the funeral in Sao Paulo. No doubt caused in part by the stress of the job, Ecclestone also had his health problems, including heart surgery and a triple coronary bypass in 1999. Despite this, he remained as active as ever even after he had reduced his shares in the company SLEC Holdings, who owned various F1 managing firms, to 25%. This move, which did not diminish any of his power but inflated the size of his bank balance, was one of many that saw Ecclestone become one of the richest men in the world. The man who started with a deep love of the sport had become someone obsessed with squeezing every penny out of it. In a role that would be seen as far too powerful these days, Ecclestone controlled both the sporting and the commercial side of the sport. He began raising the price for hosting fees, and soon Formula One's traditional tracks found their once cemented place under question. This came to a head in 2004, where he found himself at loggerheads with three-time world champion Jackie Stewart. Stewart, who had raced in F1 and won titles at the same time Ecclestone was starting out in other series, was the president of the British Racing Drivers Club, and the two were unable to agree a deal that would see the British Grand Prix stay on the calendar. The 2005 provisional schedule was missing an event in the UK, which, had it gone ahead, would have been its first absence from the calendar since the sport started. Ecclestone eventually yielded, and Silverstone was back on the calendar by December. During that time, Ecclestone also found himself the target of a lawsuit by the three banks, which owned 75% of SLEC, who wanted more control in the sport. It was a pivotal moment in Ecclestone's career, as suddenly his vice-like grip of the sport, which he held for 30 years, was at threat of being loosened. A 2-day hearing took place before a verdict in December ruled that the banks did have a right to more control. Ecclestone panicked, and after filing an appeal, he met the team bosses at a boardroom in Heathrow Airport and offered a total of £260 million over 3 years, provided they agreed to renew the Concord Agreement and keep Ecclestone in charge. They did, and Ecclestone's job was saved. It was the first stone thrown in what would slowly tick away at Ecclestone's legacy. Having been the winner of a previous war for control, Ecclestone now found himself trying to win another. Ecclestone sold more of his shares in 2005 as the F1 Supremo began to look at other ventures, even mulling over a bid for Arsenal Football Club. The man of yesteryear was also losing friends in the paddock, most notably following the 2005 United States Grand Prix, which only saw 6 cars compete, following the team's refusal to compete in using the Michelin tyre, which they deemed unsafe. His desire to reward high-paying clients over F1's traditional circuit painted a target on his back, and his refusal to embrace the rise of social media saw the sport's viewing figures begin to tumble. At the age of 87, Ecclestone's reign was over. He was removed as chief executive in 2017, following Liberty Media's purchase of the sport the previous year. Bernie Ecclestone is one of the most controversial figures in F1 history, but there are few, if any, who have had such a remarkable impact. By 2015, the sport's revenue had ballooned to $1.6 billion, and Ecclestone was the one who shaped Formula One into what it is today. From a boy who loved motorcycles to staging one of the most successful coups in sporting history, it's hard to imagine anyone else will ever leave such a huge footprint on Formula One. Thanks for watching and learning about the house Bernie built. If you want to find out more about how his legacy is still felt today, make sure to watch this video on why countries are desperate to host a Formula One race.